This is Import Export with Lawrence Christophels.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining Import Export here on Ticker TV. I'm your host, Lawrence Christophels. Today's episode's all about the increasing tensions between Australia and China and what that means for us in importers, exporters, and also the supply chain partners. So we've got a fantastic lineup of experts to provide their insights, their expertise, and tell us where this all might be heading. To kick it off, I'm joined by one of Australia's best recognised trade lawyers, Andrew Hudson from Rigby, Cooke law firm. Hi Andrew, how are you?
Thank you, Lawrence, and look, thanks for the invitation, and you're the only person I'd put a suit on for at this time of the morning.
Especially, I know that you've been working home lately, so...
Deepest, darkest Mount Eliza, and I've escaped this morning, so thank you.
Great, great to have you on, mate, after a long while. Andrew, look, I mean, you're across all breadths of different trade regulations, and I know that you're involved with ECA and all these other bodies, CBFCA as well. Where do you see this heading now? And this, people say it's been sort of brewing for a little while with the barley and the meat, but it is a bit hard to believe that there's no coincidence about the latest situation.
And I don't think there are. I mean, obviously China traditionally plays a long game, and I think we've obviously given a lot of focus on China. It's a massive market. We did extraordinarily well to get the China Free Trade Agreement up. We've got a lot of complementary free trade agreements, which might be, in some respects, the saviour or the ability to diversify. I've acted for a lot of Chinese exporters and a lot of Australian importers of Chinese goods. And we talk a lot about how China's responded to the dumping investigations, the dumping investigation in China. I know for a fact the Chinese government has always been very unhappy, as has the Vietnamese government and occasionally the Korean government, with the way in which, with the Australian dumping regime. So it's one of the interesting areas where politics and trade law and economics all intersect. So politics is always there in one way or another. You can't sort of ignore it. It's not a perfect market. It's a second best economy or second best market type arrangement. So I think there is some connection to it at the moment. And I think when markets sort of disappear or we're into this massive upheaval, probably a lot of underlying issues come out and they look to, each country is going to be a little bit protectionist. We saw our industry minister yesterday talking about the need to support Australian manufacturing industry and perhaps including that with state and federal governments. So it's natural enough in a time like this where there've been this enormous challenge to the whole world. And China feels obviously under the hammer. It wouldn't be saying the things it did unless it felt under some pressure.
Andrew, I think what you brought up there, so many things have come to the surface from a supply chain trade perspective that nationalism, protectionism, all countries are sort of really looking back to insource again or bring things back in house, especially their critical supply chains like medicinal and protective gear. What about, there's a whole feeling or vibe around consumers especially, not so much, I'm not sure about people in the trade sector, but consumers really feel like we've had too much, all our eggs in one basket with China.
And that's a pretty natural response. And look, we have. There's a degree to which there's been a massive focus on China, obviously a massive market, moving it from its previous sort of agrarian type economy into a more sophisticated economy, growing middle class, massive demand for consumer goods. And so people have naturally enough looked to China. We've had as I said before, we've had a very good trade deal with China and we've improved relationships there significantly. Now, if that were to shut down or go backwards a bit, there are other options, of course. And I think if you're talking about that, you look at the other countries with which we have trade agreements already as being markets which have been championed and opened up, and perhaps look at them. But in terms of the Australian consumer, you can understand it's almost a natural nationalism in saying, why should I be buying their products? The reality is, for an Australian company, anyone, even in manufacturing and who exports, they need inputs to manufacture. And then they're coming from Asia, whether it's China or Vietnam or Malaysia. So we can't entirely rely on local production. We just don't have that infrastructure anymore. And it didn't make sense.
And I think the diversification, even of procurement channels and supply models, in the past, companies have all looked at one country because it's cheaper for freight, they can consolidate. Now I think they want to reduce their risk profile.
That's right.
Therefore, they want to diversify their supply base as well. What other markets do you see coming up? And we've got the ASEAN, the whole 10 countries there. And what's your opinion there?
Well, for a start, I don't think we should go to the lengths which a lot of American commentators are saying, is we should all decouple from China and move to Mexico. I don't think that's on the agenda, although we do have a deal with them in terms of the TPP-11, but it's not going to be comprehensive. So we've got some pretty good deals through the North Asian FTAs. We've got China, plus we've got Korea, South Korea, and Japan. They're strong markets, and they've got in particular, Japan has an absolute demand for Australian raw materials and Australian meat and the like. In fact, under our trade agreement, we have to give Japan notice if we're going to stop supplying them. So they're really desperate for it. Then you look at other places. We've got the new deal with Indonesia coming up. There's a massive, significant opportunities there for us in terms of exporting of meat and primary produce into Indonesia. And you look at the regional cooperation deals we've got. And you look at Malaysia. So all of those ASEANs, we're pretty well sorted. Vietnam's a classic one. I've done a lot of work there, and it's extraordinary to see the way it's moved over the last 15 to 20 years. And you've got a burgeoning middle class. You've got significant amount of young people in their economy, and they're after consumer goods. They're after better quality. Sometimes they see food as an example of wealth. So you go off and you buy something that's a bit posh or a bit different. So I think that's where our opportunities are. So it isn't all doom and gloom. China was a natural jumping off point, but it comes back to everyone doing their homework and working out who they know, who they're comfortable with, and what markets they can actually de-risk to the point. So I don't think we'll end up with the same. If we are having a trade war with China, and I'm not convinced about that, there are other countries which are unlikely to have trade wars with.
And I think that, in my view, Andrew, there's just like e-commerce has been brought forward because of coronavirus. I actually think the diversification of markets has also been brought forward because Chinese manufacturers themselves were setting up in Vietnam, Cambodia, Myanmar, all these other markets. They were setting up themselves. So, as you say, some of those countries with their growing middle class, they've got great opportunity now to really create this, really fill the void, if you like.
And I think that's right. And I think it works in two ways. In Australia, the reality is we've had high dumping duties on a lot of Chinese product, whether it's steel or aluminium or products using those. That has meant that people have actually shifted out of China and they've moved to older facilities or their own facilities they've mothballed in Vietnam or in Malaysia or in Indonesia to deal with those sort of issues as well. And they do have economies which are eager for consumer goods, but also raw materials and food and the like. I think the difficult one will be the position with tourism and also tourism and education where we've still largely closed off our international borders. And you can understand that a lot of our strong tourism imports and our education people won't feel as comfortable coming here for a while. But I think there's enough diversification available, and people have to realise that there are resources out there to help them. Obviously yourself, but Austrade, Global Vic, all those people, there are lots of resources and they've got to be able to use them, and they should.
Actually, that reminds me, there is a really great webinar next week with the Australian-China Business Council.
Oh, true,
So I know the ECA's Diane's one of the speakers with that. So that's the Getting Your Goods to China webinar on Tuesday, 26th of May. There is still opportunity with China. Yes, there's, as you say, tensions. I agree with you. I don't think we're at a point of calling it a trade war.
No.
I think there is yes, China have got a lot of influence on our supply chains, but equally they like what Australia offers them as well.
Well, they do, and look, we wouldn't be sending, the government wouldn't be putting millions of dollars into air freight into China unless they believed that there was still a demand for it. The first product they sent, they called it Lobster Airlines effectively. So you had seafood going to China, and seafood was the first thing that dropped off. I was actually in China. I'm okay. In the middle of January, I was in Guangzhou. But there they were preparing for Lunar New Year, and all of a sudden news came out about something in Wuhan, and the first thing to fall off was WA seafood, lobsters and the like, and they were basically put back in the water. They had to get approval to put them back in the water, because they got approval to remove them and grow them, and therefore there are issues about what they've got and what they're allowed to do. So that was the first thing. So the first signs of the government support. Now that government support won't last forever. So people can't rely on that. And the same thing with PPE coming the other way. So it's coming the other way on the same aircraft.
Yeah, I remember.
But people can't assume that everything they buy out of China is going to be legitimate. There are some pretty strict, I've been doing some work with the TGA at the moment on some imports. And similarly for Australia, you can't just buy a lot of this stuff up and send it overseas. There are now prohibited export regulations governing that. So we've just got to realise that our normal rules have been changed a little bit. You have to be alert to those changes and ability, and able to change your supply chain and able to change the people you deal with. Which for some people will be difficult because they've spent a lot of years investing in the Chinese relationship.
Well, that's this whole buzzword for the last few months.
EU's been pivoting, America's been pivoting 360, and they're back where they start. But that's it. We either call it agility or pivoting or changing the balance or redressing the imbalance. All of those things happen. What it boils down to, you've got to be able to switch out of what you're doing if things go bad. So if all of a sudden you're exporting a product and there's a dumping investigation in China, now they have to run it according to WTO rules. The WTO has actually found it against Australia on occasion about our dumping. So it's every country has their own dumping investigations and their own strengths and weaknesses of it. If you're caught in one of those, it's going to be difficult for a smaller operator to be involved with that. And that's where they've got to, look at what government's doing and working with them.
And really be part of, as you say, stay up to date with the latest evolution of how those work.
Developments.
You've talked about, the seafood, how that dropped off. We know about barley, the abattoirs. What other sectors? I mean, there's talk about wine being affected.
Well, and look, wine had issues previously. Last year with wine, they were the shipments were being slowed up because they said they had they wanted to check it for quarantine or biosecurity purposes going into China, and people were concerned that was sort of the forefront. It was a warning shot, so to speak. Obviously, they're developing an appetite or a thirst for Australian wine and top-end product, as well as middle-of-the-range product. So that's happening. I think there's a risk of that. I think there's a risk of, we're talking about probably some of the other primary produce, sort of fruit and the like. Wool's a big threat, obviously. We exported a significant amount. In fact, our trade with China was literally on the back of that wool for many, many years before the markets opened up. And they were some of the early days. The early gains were in respect of wool for the factories of textiles. So they were pretty significant. So I think that's a risk area. And I think our pharmaceuticals, our complementary pharmaceuticals as well, which are quite popular, they took a hammering with COVID-19 because as much as they seemed to be a sort of a health option, people weren't going to the shopping thoroughfares. They weren't going to buy it, and they weren't going to spend money on a luxury product from Australia. So I think every market has to look at it carefully. Every market has to at least, I think everyone's business continuity plans went out the window. Or they dragged an old one out, which is pre-Second World War with very different arrangements. So I think people have got to take a bit of time and think about those things. And then the difficult thing will be investing resources and finding new markets, finding new people you trust. And that's where you've got to rely upon people who can tell you what's happening and what's going to happen.
And look, there's no crystal ball with all this because, as you say, all their modelling forecasts from trade perspective, but also from supply logistics perspective, is all out the window.
Correct.
It's essentially a blank canvas and everyone's starting from scratch.
That's right.
But it also really does. I want to ask you about a market like India. I mean, I know it's out of ASEAN, but you look at who could step up from an alternative to China in a big scale. Where do you see India headed with that?
Well, I think the difficulty is that India has got a significant reluctance to open up to any trade deals. We were negotiating a bilateral and we withdrew. Didn't withdraw. People have withdrawn to think about what their expectations are and change those. I think they've pulled out of the regional cooperation deal. Like America pulled out of TPP-11. I think their focus is so significantly domestic that it's going to be hard for anyone to crack. Plus they've got the issue, they're not just one big country, or like a lot of, they've got a whole bunch of different states. And bureaucracy is extraordinary, and there are taxes going across state borders. So people are always getting excited about. In fact, I saw an investment proposal came. Don't know why it came to me. I haven't got any money, but an investment proposal around investing in coffee and alcohol production in India. So I deleted it fairly quickly. But the reality is, there might be markets there, but it's going to be a really tough market to crack. So massive economy. You look at the basics: English speaking, rule of law, democracy, all those things, terrific. When it comes down to selling into a market there and knowing who the right people to talk to are, you know, whilst there are people like Austrade doing great work up there and the state government agencies, it's probably going to be a tougher market to crack. We're at an earlier stage than what we have been with our friends in China and the like.
Yeah, true.
Yeah.
So how do you see this playing out, Andrew? I'm going to ask all the guests the same question today, but
that's fine.
What's your 2 cents around, you know, how do you see this evolving over the next 3, 6, 12 months? And has this forever changed our relationship with China? It sounds like it has.
Well, look, I think it's changed it. I think it actually reflects, in some unusual way, a maturing of the relationship. For a start, they appear to be concerned about what we're saying publicly. They're concerned about Australian practice. They're concerned about their position in the world. And they see themselves probably, I would imagine, as having been under significant pressure. I think a lot of it still pivots, if I can use that word, around the relationship with the US. I think that's I won't say that's the category killer, but there's that still US-China thing, and we were on a long way out of that, and we're getting closer and closer to that middle piece.
I want to ask you on that, if I can interrupt. So I heard yesterday, and I don't know how accurate this is. I just sort of heard on the way home, but barley, because of the tariff, 80% tariff into China. America's deal with the China trade agreement means that they can actually export their barley and almost substitute what Australia's doing.
And that's what turns out. I mean, this is what we said when they entered into the Phase 1 China agreement. We said there was a risk for Australian exporters because if Australia was exporting a particular product and China had an obligation to buy a particular percentage from the US, who is going to miss out? Potentially Australian exporters. So when it comes to a lot of the products, if they're still going to observe that Phase 1 agreement, if there are products that they can get from US, they'll get them from US because they're basically contractually obliged to, from a nation state perspective. So I think to a degree we'll be ancillary to that wider deal, to those wider issues. At the moment, there's so much upheaval at the moment. So we've got the UK Brexiting, whichever way they do that. They've released their MFN tariffs, their proposed ones this couple of days ago, and they look quite positive. They've got rid of a lot of nuisance tariffs. The EU is still dealing with it, and we've still got the multilateral issues with the WTO. So even if Australia takes this issue with China to the WTO, you can go to a panel stage, but there isn't really a process beyond that. There's some alternatives being created. So that's not going to provide an instant outcome. And that's one of the issues with the WTO. It's a big organisation. Yes, there are mechanisms there. There's mandatory consultations beforehand, but they aren't going to deliver a result in a hurry. And I think what might happen if the America-China ongoing brawls were to sort of simmer down a bit and get back towards some new form of normalcy, then our relationship would pick up. But I think we have to be, obviously China wasn't thrilled with our role with the WHO, but at the end of the day, they've ended up being a co-sponsor as well.
I think it was over 100 countries jumped on board. One of them being China about the investigation, which people shouldn't forget that they did that. I like the way you worded it as maturity. I think Australia has stepped up as, instead of just a subservient trade partner, to say, look, we want to protect our values and our national interest as well. So I think that it is a good thing for Australia to represent that to the world.
And I think we have to. And keep in mind, it's not purely this trade issues. We have a degree of tension with China over the South China Sea, for example, and there have been naval tensions around that area for 100 years, effectively, or longer. So there are still issues with that, and I think the fact that we're now caught up with it is only because we're seen as having a presence in the world. We are a significant economy. We are still seen in some respects as the Western outlier
in the
region. But I think that's changing. But I think these things aren't going to go away in a hurry. And put it against the background of the COVID-19 thing, I think there's a lot of people going to be setting up a lot of whiteboards, a lot of butcher's paper to try and work it out. But I think people are developing those models now. The hard thing is for SMEs to understand what's going on and get back into that market.
And that's why we want to help them with that. Andrew, look, it's been an absolute delight to have you on the show. Definitely want to get you on again in the future.
Very happy.
I suppose to summarise all those things you said, there's some really interesting times ahead, not just with China, but with all these other emerging markets. We've got the Indonesia special show on next week, so stay tuned for that. So really enjoyed having you on, and look forward to chatting again soon.
Thanks, Lawrence. Appreciate it. Thank you.
This is Import Export with Lawrence Christophels.